You were never meant to hear this. The papers were destroyed, the land unclaimed, and the names wiped from every registry. But something remained, a house, a table, and the memory of 5 seated figures who never truly left. They say the Thornwell family ate in silence, but what they consumed was not food, it was presence, memory, grief, and the breath of those too afraid to be forgotten. You can still find it if you know where to look. Elm Hollow, a forgotten place that appears on no modern map. The road curves wrong around it, like even the earth knew to avert its eyes. But travelers, the unlucky ones, still found their way, and when they did, they saw the smoke. Not the kind that warms a hearth or cooks a meal, but a thin, gray whisper that curled out from the chimney at dusk, like something exhaled by a body no longer warm. The house sat hunched at the end of an overgrown path, its silhouette bent, waiting. The windows didn't shine. They watched, curtains drawn with surgical precision, as though whatever lived inside had nothing to hide, and everything to reveal. And still the people came. Not out of curiosity, but compulsion. A force that doesn't pull from without, but pushes from within. You've felt it. The need to know, the itch that grows when something is meant to stay hidden. That's how it starts, always. A name passed in whispers, a rumor dismissed too quickly. Then, the hollow ache, the need to understand what no man should. That's why you're here. Because deep down, some part of you remembers the hunger, the silence, the scent of marrow in the cold air. Now, pull your chair closer, because the Thornwell table is set again, and one seat remains empty, just for you. What if I told you the Thornwells were never born? No records, no graves, no photographs, and yet, every dusk, 5 shadows took their seats at a table longer than memory. People thought they were a family, but families die. These did not. There was a bailiff once, Percal Gray. He went to collect a decade's worth of unpaid taxes, thought he'd find a coward behind a door. Instead, he found the truth. The table was there, just like the stories, a place set for each. 5 chairs, fixed to the floor with iron spikes, no plates, no food, only bones, some bleached, some fresh. Gray said the air smelled like cloves and old blood. He never knocked, just stepped in, and when he did, time slowed. The figures sat motionless, but he swore they knew him. The father wore a veil, the mouth moved beneath it, forming words that refused to reach the air. Gray tried to speak, but his throat locked. No sound, just breath, cold and thin, like his own lungs had betrayed him. Then he saw the scratches. 5 gouges in the floor by the empty chair, as if someone or something had tried to rise and been pulled back down. Gray ran. That night he burned his ledger. In the morning he found 5 precise claw marks on the inside of his door, neatly arranged, like a signature. He never spoke of it again, but others did. They came with gifts, apples, bread, wreaths. No offering was ever taken inside. They withered, untouched, as if the house had no use for what still lived. And beneath the porch, they say the wood stayed warm, even in winter. What if the dead don't want to leave? What if some stay, not as spirits but as habits, rituals, repetitions stitched so deeply into the fabric of a place that even time forgets how to move forward? That's what Elm Hollow became, not haunted, held. The Thornwells didn't haunt the living, they anchored them, drew them in with silence sharper than screams, and people came, they always came, not out of belief, out of recognition. There was a woman once, her name's been lost, just a widow with shaking hands and 2 dead children. She came not to demand, but to beg, left a bundle of bread on the threshold, didn't knock, didn't wait. She turned away, and as she walked down that path she felt breath on her neck, not wind. Breath, warm, human. When she reached the gate, the muslin was in her hands again, empty, dry, as if it had never touched the wood at all. That night her youngest son began to hum in his sleep, a low, aching sound without melody. She shook him, called his name. He wouldn't wake, and in the morning, he wouldn't speak. Some said it was grief. Others said it was inheritance, because after that night, the orchard began to bloom again. An orchard that had been dead for decades suddenly exploded with pale flowers, blossoms that smelled like milk and salt. The wind carried them into the village, coating fences, rooftops, the chapel itself. And when they fell, the fruits remained, small, white, hard, and marked. Each one bore a faint ring, like tooth marks, too wide for a child, too shallow for an animal. No one dared eat them, but one boy took one home, and by morning it had vanished. Have you ever seen something alive that shouldn't be? Not a ghost, not a dream, but something real, physical, moving in a way the world never agreed to. That's what they said about the orchard. It was never just trees, it was memory, rooted, and when it bloomed it wasn't for beauty, it was for hunger. A farm boy named Thomas thought he'd test the legends. He snuck beneath the branches after dusk, while the petals still clung to the air like breath frozen in time. He picked a fruit, pale as ash, heavy in his palm. He turned it over once, twice, then saw it. A ring of shallow indents, not carved, not grown, pressed, as though a mouth had kissed it slowly, deliberately. He dropped it. When it hit the path, it split. And the sound it made, not a crack, not a thud. A whisper, soft, wet, familiar, like a secret being repeated by lips no longer warm. After that, no one touched the orchard again. But the trees, they grew bolder. Their limbs bent toward the village, not randomly, purposefully, like arms stretching toward a lover in the dark. And if you stood still long enough, quiet, alone, you could hear them. Not the wind, not the creak of bark, but breath, slow, measured, like lungs buried deep beneath the soil, inhaling the warmth of the living. Some men claimed the roots were moving, not spreading, reaching, and the old priest who once tried to bless the fields, he left without saying a word, only this: they aren't trees. He refused to say more, and by spring the frost never left the branches. Even in sunlight, they remained coated in white, not ice, ash. You're not just watching this, you're remembering. Because something in you already knows, the truth was never buried, it was arranged, like the bones on that long, unpolished table. They say a constable from Kestrel County rode in during February of 1840, thought he was bringing order, ledger in hand, list of names, deeds, dates, none of them matched. No record of the Thornwells, no births, no deaths, not even the house. He found it anyway, not because he saw it, but because it saw him. The smoke greeted him first, not rising, curling, like a question mark drawn slowly in the air, and as he approached the door, he hesitated, not out of fear, but recognition. He knocked. No answer. He waited, knocked again. Still silence. But after he left, neighbors saw the smoke thicken, twist, take shape. Some said it looked like a hand raised in greeting. Others swore it was a gesture of dismissal. He camped that night at the edge of the orchard. No fire, no food, just stillness. The dreams came hard. In them, the family sat, perfectly still, hands placed around plates that held nothing but memory. And then the mother lifted her veil. There was no face beneath it, just a void, a hole as dark as the pit of a starless sky. When he woke, his horse was gone. The bridle left neatly on a branch, his ledger folio empty. Every page vanished, except one, folded into the shape of a tongue. He never came back to Elm Hollow, not because he was afraid, but because some part of him never left. And if you're still here, still watching, ask yourself, why does this feel familiar? What part of you is already seated at the table? You think memory is safe. You think what's gone can't reach back and touch you. But the Thornwells proved otherwise. They didn't cling to the past. They fed it. There was a widow, Eleanor Black, who came in the thaw of early spring. Her eyes were hollowed by fever and grief. She had buried 2 sons. The third still clung to her hand like a promise that could break at any moment. She didn't come for vengeance. She came for mercy. She believed the Thornwells could intercede, not as saints, but as something older. She left an offering, bread wrapped in muslin, set gently on the doorstep like a child laid at a cradle. She turned away, and then she felt it, not cold, not heat, but breath, right behind her neck, too close. She did not turn. When she reached the road, she looked down. The muslin was back in her hand, empty. That night her son began to hum, a low, broken tune, no melody, no rhythm, just sound, a voice remembering a song that never existed. He wouldn't wake, and when morning came, he wouldn't speak. His eyes stayed wide open, but not blind, focused, as though watching something only he could see. They said the orchard responded that night. Blossoms fell again, too early, too many, covered the fields like a burial shroud. Wind carried the petals over fences, into wells, onto the chapel door. Some claimed they tasted like sugar, others like dust. One girl pressed them between the pages of her Bible. The next day, the flowers were still soft, but the verse was gone. Not torn, erased. And where the words had been, a ring of moisture remained, as if something had rested there and drank. They weren't waiting to be summoned. They were waiting to be remembered. A nameless preacher passed through Elm Hollow one spring. He carried no name, no doctrine, only a battered book and a copper crucifix dulled by salt air and age. He stood before the Thornwell house, knocked once, then turned away. When asked why he didn't try again, he only said, "They aren't behind the door. They are the door." And he was right, because the Thornwell family didn't live in that house. They were what the house was. It was more than wood and nail. It was invitation, a vessel, a ritual, a temple built for one sacred, terrible purpose, to feed on the ache of remembrance. That night, a single pale blossom appeared on the pulpit of the chapel. Nestled inside was something small, too small to name, a speck of bone, a tooth, a memory. The sexton swept it away without a word, and no one ever asked where he buried it. Because by then, even the faithful had begun to feel the change. The hush between breaths, the cold that started behind the teeth, that feeling that somewhere out there, something ancient was listening. And as the preacher left town before dusk, the air behind him folded shut like a page being turned. No one followed. No one spoke. But every man that watched him go felt the same thing deep in his bones. He hadn't left Elm Hollow behind. He had simply been released. If you feel the hush now, the space behind the silence, then you're already being noticed. This story isn't entertainment. It's a test, to see if you remember, and if you do, then you were never just watching, you were being called home. Not all families bury their dead in the ground. Some keep them seated, preserved in ritual, held by silence, fed by the living who forget to forget. That's what the Thornwells did. They didn't mourn, they hosted. And every supper was a ceremony, not for food, but for return. Because memory is a powerful thing. It doesn't just revisit, it resurrects. And the table, that long, unpolished slab of wood, it was never meant for meals. It was an altar. Every dusk, they sat in silence, 5 figures, always the same, and one chair left empty, not for the living, but for the one still listening. There's a reason no one ever entered that house twice, a reason no child ever played near its path. The very ground remembered, and what it remembered, hungered. A girl once pressed the petals of the Thornwell blossoms between the pages of her Bible. The next morning the page was blank, not torn, not stained, erased, except for one perfect ring of moisture, like a cup had been placed there, but no cup could leave a ring so deep, not on paper, not like that. And the girl, she stopped speaking scripture. She began speaking in rhythm, not words, but sounds, like breathing, patterned, measured, as if her lungs were learning to echo something older. That's how it begins. Not with possession, with imitation. You begin to hum, you pause too long between sentences, you stare at windows and wonder if someone's behind them. And one day, you see the table, not in the house, but in your mind, laid with places, one for sorrow, one for silence, one for memory. You want the truth? Then stop looking with your eyes. The Thornwells didn't hide in the shadows. They were the shadow, woven into habit, stitched into soil, remembered not by sight, but by repetition. And the orchard? It wasn't just cursed, it was obedient. By late spring, its trees stopped blooming in daylight. The flowers opened only after dark, and when they did, they shimmered, wet with something that was not dew. Children dared each other to listen at the bark. One boy pressed his ear against the trunk and whispered his name. The tree answered, not with words, but with sound, a slow, rhythmic creaking, like breath drawn through old lungs buried deep in the roots. He ran home with dirt in his mouth and sweetness on his tongue, and he was never the same. The villagers said his voice changed, slower, hollow, as though each word had to travel farther to reach his lips. But it was what he drew that truly unsettled them. He filled page after page with a single image, a long table, 5 seated figures, and a 6th, perched on the table itself, small, curious, and smiling. No one had told him what the table looked like, no one could have, but still, he knew. Because the Thornwell house doesn't wait for you to visit, it enters you, quietly, through breath, through memory, through the absence you carry without knowing. Every man has a silence he can't explain, a pause between thoughts, a name he forgets, until it's whispered back. That's where the Thornwells live, in that hollow. And if you're feeling it now, tight in the chest. What happens when you look too long at a place that doesn't want to be seen? It looks back. That summer, a cooper from the next valley passed through Elm Hollow, a practical man. Tall, strong hands, used to barrels and brick, not whispers and myth. He didn't believe the stories, until he passed the Thornwell house and saw the windows open. First time in anyone's memory. No curtains drawn, no dust, just glass gleaming like it had been freshly washed from the inside. He said the house was quiet, still, but wrong, like it was watching itself, pretending to be empty. Then he saw the table, set perfectly. Plates, cups, polished forks resting at precise angles. No one seated, no figures in black. But the table remembered them. The hair on his arms rose, not from cold, but recognition. He turned, walked away. But that night, he dreamt of the cups, overflowing, not with wine or water, with something thick, slow, black as oil, moving like it wanted to be poured. He woke gagging, said the taste lingered, metallic, sweet, familiar. He never returned to Elm Hollow, but for weeks he could feel the house at the edge of his vision, like it had followed him, not physically, psychologically, spiritually. There's a name for that kind of haunting, but it's not ghost, it's invitation, the kind that comes once and never leaves. Because once you've seen the Thornwell table, once your mind has shaped its presence, you've been seated, even if you don't know where. Yet, and if your breath's a little shallow now, if your throat feels dry, there's a reason. You're remembering your place, at the table. By midsummer, the orchard began to rot in reverse. The blossoms didn't wither, they fell all at once, silently, like snowfall with intention, a burial from the trees themselves. And beneath that pale drift, the fruits waited. Small globes, white as ash, marked not by bruises, but fissures. Hairline splits, clean and symmetrical. A girl named Clara gathered a basket of them in secret, thinking to press them for oil. She believed in use, not myth. But when she tried to cut the first one, the blade struck something solid. She peeled back the skin with careful fingers, and beneath it, a jawbone. Small, white, smooth as ivory, curved perfectly into the pulp. Not placed. Grown. She dropped the fruit. It began to warm in her hands. No sun, no fire, just reaction. Later she tried to find that place again, but the orchard had changed. The path was gone, the trees had closed, branches twisted tighter like ribs drawn in against a scream. Elm Hollow fell into a hush after that, not fear. Reverence. Because even those who claimed not to believe had started to notice the rules changing. Mirrors in their homes no longer reflected the orchard, dogs refused to bark in that direction, and prayers came back wrong. One pastor tried to name the power, said it was demonic, said it had no place among the living. He left town the next day. No one ever saw him pack, no one ever heard his wagon leave. Only a small patch of frost remained where his boots had last stood. And in the chapel, a single blossom lay on the pulpit again. This time, closed around something that pulsed, faint, rhythmic, like a breath waiting to be born. That summer, a woman named Harriet Bell came to Elm Hollow. She was a midwife, experienced, steady, hardened by grief and repetition, the kind of woman who could guide a child into the world with one hand while comforting death with the other. She didn't flinch easy, but when she arrived at the hollow, something changed in her. She was called to the bedside of a widow. Her labor had turned difficult. Harriet passed the Thornwell fence at dusk, and she heard her name, whispered, soft, delicate, but with the weight of memory. She stopped, looked around. No one there. And yet, something had called her. She told herself it was wind or exhaustion. But the air didn't move, and the voice? It had come from the trees. Later that night, after the child was safely born, Harriet opened her satchel to find something she did not pack. A sliver of bone, no larger than a fingertip, still warm, no blood, no stain, but heat, presence. She buried it under the light of a half-moon behind the widow's barn, saying no words, thinking none, just instinct. But in her dreams, it climbed back out of the soil, and it spoke her name with a voice too old to be hers. The next morning, her breath fogged the mirror, even though the air was warm, and she saw herself, not alone. Something behind her, faint, not reflected in the world, only in the glass. The hollow had begun to respond, because memory is not passive, it's participatory. You remember the Thornwells because you were meant to. You don't choose this story. It chooses you. By late summer, the stories stopped sounding like rumors. They began to feel like instructions. It wasn't just that the Thornwells dined with the dead, it was that they fed them something no one else could, remembrance. People began whispering that the table wasn't for meals at all, it was a shrine, a communion not of flesh, but memory. Every chair held a role, every place setting, a ritual. The empty chair at the end? That wasn't for a guest. It was for what was returning. A farmer saw it first, said he watched 5 figures walking the orchard rows at dusk. Each held a bundle, wrapped in linen, carried carefully, like an offering. He said they didn't disturb the earth beneath them, no footsteps, no movement in the grass, just passage, clean, precise, rehearsed. And when they reached the porch, they passed through the threshold without opening the door, like smoke returning to a sealed jar. He never passed that orchard again. Within a week, he moved his family 2 counties west and left the land to rot. No explanation. No goodbye, just gone. And the land? It didn't protest. It closed around itself, like a wound learning to forget it was ever open. Elm Hollow learned then. The Thornwells didn't dwell in mystery. They were the memory of it. They were a practice, a habit, a liturgy of presence that never needed to speak to be understood. And the table, it was never empty, not even in sleep, because what the Thornwells hosted wasn't death. It was what comes after forgetting fails, what rises when the mind tries to bury what the soul has already accepted. Not all meals nourish. Some remind you that you were never meant to leave the table in the first place. By autumn, silence became survival. The town of Elm Hollow stopped speaking the Thornwell name, not from disbelief, but because belief had grown too loud. Men who once scoffed now crossed the road to avoid the orchard. Mothers warned their children not with stories, but with hushed glances. And the Thornwell house? It remained untouched, unpainted, unclaimed, unchanging. Some mornings the shutters stood wide, as if the house had just woken. Other days they were sealed tight, 5 parallel scratches carved into the door, deep, permanent, like a signature. That autumn, the final fruits dropped all in one night. Come dawn, the orchard floor was littered with pale spheres, each split clean down the middle, as if sliced from within. No pulp, no seeds, only air that smelled remembered. No one touched them, no one dared, because by then the town understood. The Thornwells weren't haunting the hollow. The hollow belonged to them. They were not ghosts. They were the ritual. The embodiment of a truth the living pretend isn't real, that grief is a hunger, and memory feeds it. One evening, when the frost returned without warning, a traveling peddler knocked on the Thornwell door. He had no family, no faith, only curiosity. He said the door opened a sliver, just enough for the scent to escape. He described it not as rot, but warmth, like a stew cooked in another room. comforting, wrong. He saw the table, 5 chairs occupied, 1 empty, and a cup, dark, still, waiting. He fled before the door opened further, but he told one man this before he vanished. It wasn't that I saw them, it's that they knew me, like I had already been seated, just waiting to return. As the frost thickened and the orchard hardened, something darker began to press against the edges of the village. Not wind, not weather, but awareness. Men started waking in the night with their mouths full of soil. Women reported dreams of a table stretching beyond the limits of vision, set endlessly with plates made of bone. And the children? They began to hum, low, repetitive, no melody, just rhythm, a rhythm that matched the wind, except it didn't stop when the wind did. One mother said she caught her daughter sitting cross-legged in the field, her eyes rolled back, palms open to the sky. When she called her name, the girl responded without turning. They're not dead, they're just remembering differently. By then, the town knew. The Thornwells had never left. They had changed shape. They had moved into memory itself. And here's the truth. They don't want you to know. Rituals don't need participants. They need observers, witnesses, you. Because the deeper you look, the more it looks back. The more you try to understand the table, the closer you sit to it. That's how the old systems work. They don't demand belief, they demand attention. That's the real power, not terror, but invitation disguised as folklore. The Thornwells didn't trap people, they taught them how to volunteer. And so, I ask you now, if you've felt your breath hitch, if your thoughts have slowed, if you feel a silence forming behind your ears, you're already inside. Now, do something to lock it in. Comment the phrase, "I remember the empty chair" below, twice. That's how they'll know. That's how you'll know. You're not visiting the story. You're returning to it. You've spoken the phrase, and now, it's listening. There are names that survive not because they were passed down, but because they were never allowed to fade. Thornwell is one of them. Not a family, not a lineage, but a function. By the winter of 1840, the house no longer waited for visitors. It reached out. Nathan Cole, an aging farmer with no patience for tales, found a path cleared through the orchard one morning. Straight, clean, unnaturally precise, like the trees had bent themselves out of the way in the night. The path led directly to the back of his barn. No footprints, no tire ruts, just a trail and a bundle, wrapped in rough cloth, bound with a knot of hair. He didn't open it. He buried it beneath the oak tree where his father once hung tools, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. The next morning, the bundle was on his porch rail, same knot, same dampness, same scent of broth. He packed that afternoon and left Elm Hollow forever. But the hollow never left him. For the rest of his days, he claimed to hear breathing from the empty corners of every room. Not fast, not threatening, just deliberate, like something waiting for its name to be said again. That's the part no one explains. Hauntings don't begin with sightings. They begin with recognition. The moment you admit you noticed, that's when it starts. The Thornwells never needed to be seen. They only needed you to know what the table looked like. Because once you've pictured it, you're part of the ritual. You're a chair waiting to be filled, and whether you believe it or not, the invitation has already been sent. There's a threshold every man must cross when the stories stop being entertainment and start being recognition, and once you cross it, you don't go back, you don't laugh, you don't look away, you look inward, and you remember what you were taught to forget. In early January of 1841, a letter arrived at the Kestrel County Post, unsigned but written in an ink the clerk said looked like root water, thick, tannin dark, almost alive. Inside, only one sentence. The 6th place has been set. The marrow remembers. No return address, no seal. The postmaster, a war veteran and hardened man, read it once, then burned it without ceremony. That night, his house filled with the scent of cloves and rust. His wife claimed the chimney exhaled even though no fire had been lit. By morning, the curtains had yellowed like old teeth, and in the center of the parlor table, a single cup. Empty, unfamiliar, ancient in design. Its rim bore 5 etched notches. The 6th was freshly carved. This is how the Thornwell presence spread, not through blood or violence, but through familiarity, through the slow realization that the table was never inside the house. The house was inside the table, the structure, the orchard, the silence. It was all seating, architecture made from obedience, and once a place learned its posture, it became part of the ritual. That's what nobody tells you about old powers. They don't arrive with thunder. They arrive like memory. Slow, total, undeniable. And if you've begun to see chairs where none were before, if empty places make you uncomfortable now, then you know what's happening. The sixth place has been set, and it has your name. There's a moment in every descent where the ground stops feeling solid, not because it crumbles, but because it starts to breathe. That's where you are now. The air in Elm Hollow had changed. It didn't just carry the chill of winter, it carried something intentional. Each gust felt like a whisper from lungs older than language. People stopped calling it wind. They called it the hush. It moved through town like a veil, soft, heavy, thick with unspoken invitations. One blacksmith, tough as iron and twice as stubborn, claimed he didn't fear the Thornwells. He sharpened his blades at midnight and scoffed at omens. Until the morning he found all his tools rusted through, not from moisture, but from silence. His grindstone was dust, his forge cold despite the coals. And there, in the middle of the anvil, was a single fruit, pale, unrotted, split clean. Inside, a tongue, not rotting, not dry, just waiting. He left town without speaking a word, because that's how the ritual protects itself. When you break the hush, it breaks you back. The Thornwell family didn't build a legacy. They wove one, out of pause and pattern and reverence. They were a system of unseen control, a psychological engine that trained the village not through fear, but through repetition. No one told you not to speak their name. You felt it. No one ordered you to leave offerings. You simply did, and by the time you noticed your will had bent, it was too late. You were already kneeling, already listening, already learning to wait for a chair that hadn't yet appeared in your room, but soon will, and when it does, you'll know where to sit. They say madness begins with voices, but the truth is more dangerous. Madness begins with understanding. Too much, too quickly. A glimpse behind the veil before you're strong enough to carry what you've seen. By February, Elm Hollow had become a place of still gestures and averted eyes. Children no longer played outside after dusk. Doors were double-latched, not against thieves but memory. Because now everyone knew the truth, the Thornwell house wasn't an exception. It was an example, a blueprint for how ancient systems preserve themselves, not by defending their walls, but by rewriting your sense of safety. Control doesn't come through violence. It comes through ritual, through routine, through the silent agreement not to question what has always been. The constable from Greystone Parish came next, young, rational, armed with documents and skepticism. He stood at the Thornwell porch at noon, not midnight, spoke aloud, knocked twice. No one answered, but his journal, recovered later, described something far worse. The door was shut, but I swear I heard them chewing. He didn't mean food, he meant remembrance. He meant us. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in his rented room staring at a table that hadn't been there the night before. It wasn't real wood. It was too smooth, too pale. And at the center, a cup, dark liquid, still as thought. By morning the constable was gone. Only the table remained. No one remembered his name after that. Not his captain, not his sister, not even the innkeeper who housed him, like he had never been assigned. The Thornwells didn't need to harm you. They needed only one thing, your forgetting, because that's how they fed, and that's how they grow stronger every time someone tells themselves, it's just a story. There are places in this world that do not want to be found, and then there are those that wait. Not to be discovered, but to be remembered. That was the Thornwell house. Not a ruin, not a mystery, but a returning. By March, the land itself had grown unnatural. Trees leaned in patterns too deliberate to be wind-shaped. Roots formed arcs like bent limbs, as though bowing toward some deeper gravity. And at the center, always, the table. You didn't have to see it to feel it. It was in the rhythm of your thoughts. The way your hunger changed at twilight. The way dreams began to taste like marrow. A preacher from the southern counties came on foot. No cross, no book, just a handful of salt in each pocket. He said he didn't come to cast out the dark. He came to understand its language. Locals found him days later at the chapel steps. His hands were folded, his eyes were closed, but his mouth, it was open, as though mid-sentence or mid-invitation. No breath, no heartbeat, just stillness. And in his left hand, a fragment of wood, curved, polished, bone-white. Not a relic, a utensil. There was no panic in Elm Hollow, only resignation. The kind that sets in when people realize they are not part of a story. They are part of its setting. The Thornwells were not haunting a house. They were occupying memory, residing in the places your mind avoids, and they grew stronger every time someone tried to explain them away. Because logic is their camouflage, but ritual, that's their weapon. That's how they prepare the table. With every denial, every rationalization, another chair pulls itself out and waits. They never needed you to believe in ghosts. They only needed you to believe in custom, because ritual is obedience dressed in tradition, and obedience is how systems survive. By early spring, Thornwell House had stopped pretending to be dormant. The orchard bloomed with no season. The air was thick with the smell of broth, salt, and something almost like blood, but cleaner, like metal remembered in a dream. A scholar from the capital, an expert in architectural superstitions, arrived to catalog the building. She was thorough, measured foundations, sketched door frames, recorded every hinge, every flaw, every angle of the dining hall. She said the dimensions were impossible, each wall measured true in isolation, but when combined, the internal geometry disagreed with itself, as if the house disobeyed space. She slept one night in the parlor. When she woke, her sketches had changed, not the lines. The furniture, where there had been 5 chairs, there were now 6, and a cradle in the corner. She hadn't drawn a cradle. No one had mentioned a child. But there it was, rocking gently, as if soothed by a hand that had long since turned to vapor. She didn't return to the city. She didn't return anywhere. Because that's the curse of contact. When you map the hidden, it begins to map you. That's how institutions protect themselves. They do not erase the truth. They smother it in documentation until only a few notice what's missing between the lines. And those few, they go quiet or they disappear. Because when the structure is older than language and the table was set before your grandfather's bones cooled, there is no escape, only delay. Only the slow creak of a chair being pulled out, with your name stitched beneath the cushion. The cradle. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a wound in the timeline, a place where something was supposed to end, but didn't. No one remembered a Thornwell child. But the records, those that hadn't been swallowed by blank ink or chewed margins, hinted at a 6th presence long before the first visitor ever knocked. A shape, smaller than the others, more curious than reverent, tilting its head at dusk like it heard music the rest of us had forgotten how to hear. The cradle was not for sleeping, it was for keeping. And in the months that followed, people in Elm Hollow began to report dreams of lullabies, sung in a language they couldn't speak, but understood. Mothers felt watched while folding linens. Fathers found child-sized footprints in the soot by the hearth. Always 6 toes, always facing inward. A midwife, Harriet Bell, you'll recall her, confessed to seeing her own name carved beneath the cradle's rim. In bone. When she tried to tell the chapel, the floorboards opened mid-sermon. Just a fraction, just enough for her shoe to slide in, like a mouth tasting her fear. She did not return. But her satchel did. Hung neatly on the chapel door the next morning. Inside, folded like a sacrament, was a single baby's bib, stitched from her own hair. You think that's exaggeration? You think this is a tale? Ask yourself, why does the thought of an empty cradle make your spine tighten? Why do you feel like something small is standing behind you, waiting to be picked up? It's not your imagination. It's remembrance. Because the Thornwells never needed a child. They needed an inheritor. Someone who wouldn't ask why the cup is full, only when it will be their turn to drink. There's a deeper kind of inheritance than blood. A legacy older than name, older than law, one that moves not through will or wealth, but through repetition. And by now, you've repeated enough. In Elm Hollow, the orchard had stopped blossoming. Instead, the branches grew inward, curling like fingers around the invisible. Locals began to whisper of a new figure seen at the edge of the woods, small, slender, cloaked in dust, not walking, drifting, and always just far enough that no one could describe its face. They called it the Heir, because somehow everyone knew it was next, not born, not summoned, but promised. It moved like a question still being written. One woman, Ruth Calder, claimed she woke at midnight to find a fruit on her windowsill. Not from the orchard, not from this world. It was soft and breathing. She swore it blinked when she reached for it. She didn't touch it, but that morning her mouth was stained red. Not blood, pulp. And beside her bed, 5 fingerprints burned into the wood. Not hers, not her husband's. Smaller. Authorities never came. Because by then, no one outside Elm Hollow remembered Elm Hollow. Maps shifted. Mail returned marked, no such place. Even satellite records in the century to come would glitch and warp when scanned over the region, because that's how memory works when it's claimed. The Thornwells weren't vanishing, they were enfolding, drawing the world into their shape. And you, right now, you're part of that. This story isn't about what happened, it's about what's still happening. The house isn't past, it's present tense, and the table, still set, still waiting, because some inheritances don't need a will, they just need you to keep watching. There's a moment, if you've made it this far, where something in you begins to shift. A subtle ache behind the eyes. The sense that you're no longer just hearing this tale, you're being read by it. By spring's end, the Thornwell orchard bore no more fruit, but the trees. They pulsed. At night, their branches stirred without wind, brushing one another in patterns so precise they left markings on the bark, glyphs of old languages not spoken but remembered. The hollow's children began to hum again. Not songs, not tunes. Codes. A boy named Elias was heard reciting syllables in his sleep, words no one taught him. He spoke them with the calm of someone remembering instructions. That morning he brought a cup to school, not his, old, heavy, smelling of cloves and rust. He said simply, "They gave it to me." And in the bottom of the cup, 5 teeth, none his, still wet. His teacher locked the cup in a cabinet, but by dusk it had reappeared on her desk full again. No one ever saw her after that day. Only a smear of salt along the threshold of her home. If you've been feeling it, the weight of something watching from the corners of your room, the sense that you've been invited to something without knowing when you RSVP'd, it's not paranoia, it's progress. You're remembering what was never meant to be forgotten. And now, as promised, if this story has reached beneath your skin, write this in the comments, twice. I see the 6th chair, I won't look away. Say it again, I see the 6th chair, I won't look away. It locks the transformation. It tells the table, you are no longer asleep, and from here, there is only down. The 6th chair is no longer empty, not because someone sat in it, but because you've seen it. That's the power of attention. It doesn't just observe, it activates. And now, the house knows your name. By late April, Elm Hollow no longer recognized itself. Mirrors fogged in homes that had no steam. Family portraits changed subtly, smiles softened, postures slumped, backgrounds darkened with a shadow that hadn't been there before. No one could agree on when it started, only that it never stopped. A mason repairing the chapel foundation found a small bundle wrapped in muslin buried beneath the stones. Inside was a child's spoon, bone-handled, smooth, still warm. He dropped it. But later that night he was seen in the orchard, barefoot, mumbling, following a path no one else could see. His boots were found outside the chapel door. Inside one of them, a folded page from a prayer book. But in place of scripture, a single line written in brown ink, "The meal continues." It was then the townsfolk understood. This wasn't a haunting. It was a function, a machine powered by memory, fed by silence. You weren't cursed for looking too long, you were selected, because some houses aren't built to shelter, they're built to process, to digest the living into legacy. The Thornwells never sought escape. They embedded in rituals, in superstition, in the hidden grooves of your daily routine. Ever wonder why you knock on wood, or why silence falls at certain hours, heavy as velvet? Those aren't coincidences, they're inheritances, passed down through breath, blink, and blood. The table doesn't need believers, it needs participants. And now you've been seated, the cup before you is full, and the meal just beginning. There are truths so old they forget how to speak plainly. Instead, they move through symbols, smells, dreams, and meals that taste like reminders. By midsummer, the Thornwell property was no longer viewed as abandoned. It was active, not loud, not violent, just present. It existed with a kind of authority no law could displace. A pair of government men arrived to survey the land. New development plans, they said. They entered the orchard with measuring tools, bright vests, polite skepticism. Only one returned. He had aged. His face sagged like time had been accelerated inside him. He didn't speak of what he'd seen, only wrote one sentence before vanishing from public record. The table does not wait. The tools were found days later, stacked neatly beside the Thornwell porch, each marked with tiny indentations, like something small had chewed through memory itself. The locals no longer spoke aloud near the orchard, whispers only. One woman hung wind chimes made of iron spoons on her porch, claiming the sound kept the silence from listening too closely. She disappeared in August. The chimes never moved again. But one evening, a boy walking past said he saw them spinning wildly. There was no wind, only a low hum in the earth, like breath drawn in slowly, waiting to be released. You think you're safe because you're watching this on a screen, that stories need proximity to touch you? No. Stories like this don't need your belief, only your attention, and you've given it. So now the question becomes, will you finish your portion or leave the table hungry? Because here's the secret no one dares write down. The Thornwells aren't waiting for you to join them. They're already in the house. And they brought an extra chair. You've stayed this long. That means something. Not to me, not to history, but to them. The Thornwells don't need followers. They need witnesses. By autumn, the orchard stopped shedding fruit. Instead, it began to whisper. Not sound exactly, but something in the bones, the shiver down the back, the way a room feels smaller when you close your eyes. Children stopped playing near the fence. The air was too thick, like breath already taken. A man named Joel Price claimed he found a journal beneath his floorboards, one he'd never owned, never written. Each page described his thoughts before he'd had them. At the back, a diagram of the Thornwell table, each seat marked with a symbol. One matched the birthmark on his neck. He burned the book. But the next morning, the table had been drawn in ash across his front porch. His family moved within the week. The house refused new tenants, and still the pattern repeated. Because you don't bury legacy, you feed it. The Thornwell house didn't want your fear. It wanted your repetition, your rituals, your quiet obedience to patterns you didn't choose. Why do you leave one seat open at gatherings? Why do you avoid mirrors after midnight? Why does the old part of you flinch when you hear silence stretch just a second too long? You were taught, without knowing, conditioned to participate in a table set centuries ago. That's the trick, isn't it? The most powerful systems never announce themselves. They invite you. One small gesture at a time. And once you've dined, truly dined, you never leave hungry. Only hungrier. Because the last course, it's always you. And now we arrive at the last breath. Not an ending. A clearing of the throat so something older can speak through you. Because that's what this was always about, not entertainment, initiation. The Thornwell house still stands, not in maps, not in deeds, but in structure, the rituals you repeat without knowing why, in the silence between clicks, in the way you hesitate before closing the door at night, in the empty chair you never sit in. That chair, you filled it the moment you heard this story. Don't you feel it? The way the air feels watched now, that's not fear. It's recognition. The table knew you long before you found this video. It has always known, because memory isn't backward-facing. It's hungry. And now you've fed it. Every skipped heartbeat, every shiver, every time your eyes flick to the doorway behind you. That was part of the offering. You think you'll leave this behind, shut the screen and forget. You won't. Because you've learned what they never wanted you to know. Not all families bury their dead. Some dine with them, and some become them. You were never just the audience, you were the heir. And the table has one rule only. If you see the sixth chair, you must sit. So now you have a choice. Comment once more. I see the sixth chair. I won't look away. Lock it in, speak the unspeakable, or stay silent, and wonder why mirrors show 6 shadows where there should only be one. Because supper never ends. It only waits.